Welcome to Lawyer Like an Athlete podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome into an all new episode of Lawyer Like an Athlete podcast with Dr. Amy Wood. I am your host, Mike Leon. You know, Amy here is a licensed psychologist, executive coach. She's also the author of a book out there called Lawyer Like an Athlete, an ABA published book that challenges how the legal profession really thinks about performance, stress, and success. For more than a decade as well, she's worked closely with attorneys through CLE programs, coaching, and law firm consulting, focusing on what it actually takes to thrive in a profession that, let's be honest, it's built on extreme pressure. Today's episode, we're going to introduce Amy to the audience and talk about Amy's work. We're going to talk about why attorney stress is different, why most wellness advice misses the mark, and how viewing lawyers through the lens of elite athletes actually changes the entire conversation about lawyers. Amy, it's good to see you as always. You know, there always used to be jokes about lawyers, but you're right. It is a very hard profession. But before we get into that and your work, since this is the first time you're introducing yourself to the audience, share a little bit about your professional background. What made you want to start working on these high achieving professionals?
Sure. So I had a prior career in communications in the corporate context, and I was working for a very large company, Dow Jones, most people are familiar with, and had really gotten to a place where I was making good money. I felt like, I should be really happy in this position. I've made it. I've climbed the ladder. And what I noticed was there were people all around me who were older than me who had achieved at higher levels than me, and all of them had health problems. Some of them were overweight. Some of them had already been married a couple of times. They were drinking too much, going out for actual 3 martini lunches. And I thought, you know what? I don't want to be that person, but I don't want to give up my ambition. So it became my mission to try to figure out how to do that for myself. And as I got more into that, I decided to go back to school and become a psychologist and help other people to do that. And it's taken off from there.
You know, as somebody who worked in corporate America as well for some pretty big companies, you kind of look at the demanding corporate environment, right? And you mentioned a little bit of that with the stress. So when you kind of look back on that period before we dive into the topic, what did you observe the most? You mentioned the health issues, but what did you observe the most about the pressure and how overworked people were?
Well, what I observed the most, and this has only become more pronounced as I've moved on with my career, is that we have it all wrong in our country. When we think of productivity, we think only about that actual work, like you're sitting there doing your work, whether it's working on a high level thinking project online on your laptop, or actually being out in the world using your hands, like a roofer, for example, on the other extreme. And we don't factor in that in order to be productive, we have to take time to recover. And that this belief that we tend to have in this country that downtime, having fun, getting enough sleep and all that interrupts productivity. It's actually the foundation for productivity. And when you open up your life to have that recovery time, you're far more efficient and way more successful when you're actually at work.
Couldn't agree more, Amy. And hopefully a lot more people will listen to this and start to understand that. So let's dive a little bit into, because you mentioned obviously you went into psychology. So now you started working with some of these driven professionals just across all these fields. What are the patterns now that you're seeing that are surfacing around the ambition, the stress, or even the sustainability?
I think it's becoming more stressful for people because we're moving so much faster. We have so many more demands, so many distractions every single day. And along with that, we have an escalated fear that if we don't keep moving faster to keep up with that ridiculous pace that's really set by technology, that we're going to miss out on something. And we end up going faster and faster and faster to keep up, working longer and longer hours. And then what I see happening with a lot of professionals is they just burn out and they can't work, some of them, because they've pushed themselves way too hard because they're not taking that recovery time.
Well, I mentioned the name of the podcast, right, in terms of lawyering like an athlete. And I want to get into the lawyers because about 10 years ago, if my understanding is correct, you began focusing more on attorneys. So what are some of the differences you started to notice about the pressures that lawyers face and the pressures that you've seen comparable to other high performance professions?
Well, it all started when I started to get calls from state bar associations. The first bar association I worked with was the Florida bar. And this was at a time when studies were starting to come out about attorneys being more stressed than other professionals because they have less control over their schedules. The work never ends, it can be adversarial. And so the Florida bar said to me, we're looking for people to present on how to be healthier as an attorney because there's no information out there. And from there, I started to work with other bar associations. And what I noticed very quickly is that a lot of attorneys started coming to me saying, I really like your continuing legal education CLE webinars because you are actually giving relevant advice. Someone attorney might say to me, first time we talk, I've been to psychologists, I've been to executive coaches, and they tell me things that are useless. It's just like spitting into the wind, basically. Advice like, do some chair yoga or take a few deep breaths. That just doesn't cut it. And what I started to notice is that similar to attorneys, famous athletes, the most celebrated sports figures, they have very demanding jobs where they have to put their work at the center. They have to be in tip top shape to do their work, or else they'll break down. And athletes, different from attorneys, they have a sensible approach to their work. So they know that they have to train so that they compete and be at the top of their game, but they also understand that part about recovery, how they have to, yes, train physically, but then they have to get away from the field and they have to spend time working on their thinking. They have to have other kinds of diversions so that they can let go of the stress and escape to replenish, doing things that lawyers might say are really silly, like getting together with your friends and just having a good time, laughing, or engaging in reading science fiction or fantasy or playing a video game, doing something that's very different from working so that you can get away and refresh your perspective. And most importantly, working on your thinking. This is something that athletes do very, very well because they're under so much pressure. They have to really work on their mindset, and they have to think before they respond. They have to train themselves to respond in different ways depending on how much pressure they're under. And I thought, what? Athletes get it, and attorneys need to get it too. And that's why I decided to come up with my program, Lawyer Like an Athlete, using peak performance tips from the world of sports, not just basic, stress management techniques that work for other professions. And let's face it, every profession is stressed right now in this fast-paced world with all these demands and distractions. But if you think about attorneys, they're at a much higher level of stress because they have really spiked pressures, high stakes they're dealing with every day, just like professional athletes when they're competing and especially when they're training. So, attorneys have to think about it differently. They can't be applying these palliative methods that work for other professions that are less stressed. They have to really go within and change their mindset and really change the way that they're approaching their work.
No, it's well said. And I was going to ask you about that distinction that you talked about in the book with respect
Mhm.
to the lawyers and this profession. So let me ask you, the book also kind of looks at outside the legal profession, excuse me, for the answers. And we talked about the comparison to elite athletics. So can you give me a little bit of when you examine some of these top athletes and how they perform under pressure? What stood out to you about how they're supported to sustain that level of intensity? How does that compare to lawyers?
Well, I think for athletes, I noticed that there are four components that surround their work. And let me preface this by saying a lot of attorneys who come to me saying, I'm just so frustrated because I've gone to counselors and I've gone to coaches and psychologists and they just don't get it. And they're not giving me any advice that really works. Um, some of the advice that they're getting is like, your work isn't that important. Just put it aside and go have fun. And, attorneys like professional athletes, they can't do that. Imagine if you said to a professional athlete who's competing at the top level, You just need to get away from work for a while and stop training. How well are they going to do in competition? They won't do well at all. So the first thing that attorneys have to do when they're looking at how attorneys or how athletes do it is look at the fact that athletes put their work in the center. And then what they do, instead of making their work everything, they recognize that there are four components that they have to surround their work with in order to nourish their performance, to nourish their success. And those four components are, number one, taking exquisite care of yourself. Now, attorneys obviously don't have to go to the great lengths that athletes go to, but they need to understand that even though they're not doing physical work at a high level, the brain is physical. And you need to take care of your brain by taking care of every other part of yourself, mind, body, soul. It's about all of it. So making sure you're taking exquisite care of yourself, making sure that you have a really strong support system, because as human beings, especially human beings under high pressure, attorneys need that support just like athletes do. So think about, if you have a favorite athlete, think about their entourage. Athletes usually travel from one event to the next where they're competing with some of their closest friends and family members, with their coach. They're maybe traveling with a sports psychologist to help them with their thinking. Maybe their massage therapist, their physical therapist. So they have a very tight support system that they thrive in the center of. And they need that support. They recognize that. Attorneys need that too. And yet most attorneys I talk to tell me, I don't have any time for relationships. I have to work all the time. So there's the taking exquisite care of yourself, having a really strong support system at work and at home, in your community, having those nourishing diversions I talked about. And I'll give you an example. A lot of NFL players, they play chess regularly. They get away from the world of football and escape into another activity that allows them to relax and think differently, so they're not burning out all the resources they're using internally to be good at football. And that only allows them to come back better, sharper, stronger. So same with attorneys. And then the final thing, which I've mentioned before, it's mindset, making sure that you have a tough mindset that is positive, that can be flexible when necessary, that can shift when necessary, because just like in professional sports where things can change instantly and you have to respond to that quickly or you might lose the whole game, it's the same with attorneys. Things can go sideways all of a sudden, and you can't let that drag you down. So those are the four components, and those components are covered in my book with a lot of different strategies.
It's not necessarily about what happens, it's how you respond, right, Amy?
Oh,
So,
yeah, you
yeah.
couldn't say that any better.
Yeah, well, I heard that from Dwayne Wade, so I'm going to take that.
Yeah.
So there you go. But as we put a bow on this episode, and since this is your first episode here in this series, what do you want listeners to kind of understand right away about how this conversation is going to differ from the usual ways that lawyers' stress or performance is discussed elsewhere?
Well, I think the problem we have right now, as I said, what's causing us the most stress in our world, every adult who is ambitious can speak to this. It's just having too much information, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of information that's completely useless, a lot of redundant information, and a lot of us out there doing podcasts and communicating in other ways, a lot of influencers. We're just throwing out that same information, just throwing spaghetti at a wall to see what sticks. And I don't want to contribute to that. So that's number one. I'm doing this podcast because I believe I have something more interesting than what's already out there to say, and actually more useful. And I think the most important thing for listeners to understand about Lawyer Like an Athlete and my approach is that I talk in ways that make things sound simple, and it is pretty simple what I just described. Put your work in the middle and surround it with these four components that will allow you to improve at your top level. But you know what? It's not easy to implement, especially in the world of law, where the mentality is pretty screwed up, actually, when it comes to workaholism and this idea of, you really are a good attorney because you're always working, you don't take breaks, you put your work at the front of everything all the time. You don't understand the importance of taking care of yourself or having relationship as a way, or, getting into other interests away from work, or working on your mindset as a key to peak performance, you look at all that again as an interruption. And a lot of old school lawyers think what I'm saying is ridiculous. I'll be perfectly honest and tell you that I have had a couple of speaking engagements where I'm set to speak at a very big firm and it's canceled after someone higher up reads my book and they say, we don't want people taking care of themselves. We want people working their asses off. And so it's very hard to break through that belief system that's so distorted and unhelpful and only driving burnout with attorneys. And so people who read my book and want to apply it and listen to this podcast and want to apply it, you've got to be ready to be brave. You've got to be ready to stand up to a destructive status quo and start doing things differently. You have to be a role model. You have to be a pioneer. And, sometimes people I've worked with, they've had to leave their law firms. I've worked with people who have quit law altogether because they couldn't find a way to stand up to that and be healthy and still be respected. So I think that's the important message for the listeners, is simply that you're going to hear different things on this podcast. You're going to hear a lot of things coming out of my mouth that are highly controversial. But I'll also say that as a psychologist and as a very ambitious adult myself who has a very balanced, very full, very happy life, I know that all of this works. And I have plenty of clients who have seen that, plenty of attorney clients who are thriving because they have stood up to the status quo and taken some very brave steps.
Yeah. It's great stuff, and we look forward to future episodes. Amy, thank you so much for introducing yourself to the audience and breaking this all down. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. That was great.
And that wraps up today's episode of Lawyer Like an Athlete podcast. If you want to learn more about Dr. Amy Wood, you want to learn about her coaching work, the book that I mentioned before, and she mentioned Lawyer Like an Athlete, do me a favor right now. Visit amywoodpsyd.com. Do me one other favor before you go. Like, subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I am Mike Leon. We will see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.